Have you ever been told directly by a family member, "No one will choose you," and they said it as if it were the absolute truth? If it were you, what would you do? Argue back, leave, or silently accept it and move on as if your heart had never been hurt? In Redwood Plain, Nebraska, in the late 19th century, where the wind never ceased to blow across the arid fields, Hannah Cole lived her entire life on a farm where she was never considered a woman to marry. One autumn morning, her father, George Cole, told her in a calm, almost cold voice, "You should stop dreaming. No one will choose you. No shouting, no anger." Just one sentence, but enough to stay in that woman's heart for years. Hannah didn't leave. She stayed, worked, remained silent, and gradually came to believe that perhaps her father was right. Until a man from outside the story appears, Samuel Wright, a taciturn cattle rancher who has rejected many suitable marriages. And he said something no one at Redwood Plain had ever said to Hannah: "You are everything I've ever wanted." If you were in their shoes, rejected your whole life, would you dare believe that you still deserve to be chosen? Or will you be afraid that it's just pity? Sit back, breathe, slowly, and join us as we delve into a story that's quiet, but one that can touch the deepest corners of your heart. If you love heartwarming stories that touch upon human dignity, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to join us from this moment on. The story begins. Red Willow Farm, nestled on the southern edge of Wyoming, where meadows stretched so far that the sky seemed to slant down to the ground on calm afternoons. There, autumn arrived earlier, in the memories of those who had lived long enough with the land. That morning a thin layer of dew settled on the wooden fence, and the old willows by the small stream began to shed their leaves slowly, as if they too had no hurry. Margaret Hale had lived in Red Willow for nearly 40 years. No one in the small town of Dry Creek remembered the exact date she arrived for. In fact, she never left. Margaret was born in the log cabin east of the farm, growing up surrounded by the smell of hay, sweat, and simple meals cooked over a wood-fired stove. She knew how to saddle a horse from a very young age, could discern the sound of the wind signaling rain, and knew when to be silent, a skill no one taught but one that anyone who lived long enough in this land had to learn. They didn't call Margaret the girl, nor did they call her the woman. She was simply Margaret of the Hale, always there doing what needed to be done and asking for nothing more. When neighbors needed help, Margaret was there. When winter came early, she was the one counting the sacks of potatoes and barley. But in conversations about marriage, something every small town considered a milestone in a person's life, her name was rarely mentioned. That morning Margaret got up before sunrise. She lit the fire, put in the kettle, and sliced bread from a loaf that had hardened from the cold night. Her father, Thomas Hale, sat at the wooden table near the window, his calloused hands resting on his knees. He had aged considerably after years of successive droughts. His once black hair was now white, but his voice retained the firmness of a man more accustomed to giving orders than listening. They ate breakfast in silence. Not a tense silence, but a silence that had lasted too long to bother anyone. Margaret poured coffee for her father, carefully avoiding spills. She looked out the window where the first rays of sunlight filtered through the sparse foliage. Thomas spoke up near the end of the meal, his voice even and low as if he were talking about the weather. "At your age," he said without looking at her, "you should stop pretending anyone will ever choose you." The words fell onto the dining table like a small stone. No noise, no shattering, but they sank very deep. Margaret didn't put her hand to her chest. She didn't ask again. She just nodded slightly, a familiar reflex, when she didn't know what to do with things she couldn't argue with. In that moment she felt like an old chair in this house, still usable, still necessary, but no one thought to take it outside for others to see. Thomas continued drinking his coffee as if he had just stated the obvious. To him, it wasn't cruelty. It was the truth. In this land, truths are often stated without sugarcoating. Margaret cleared the dishes. The sound of the porcelain clinking was so soft it was almost imperceptible. She went out into the backyard where the autumn wind blew a few dry leaves. She stood there for a long time, her hands resting on her apron, looking out at the harvested fields. There were no tears, no anger. Just a familiar feeling like when one accepts an old pain that suddenly flares up, then subsides. In the town of Dry Creek it was often said that time would teach a woman her place. Margaret had learned that lesson well. She no longer expected anyone to see her differently. She had stopped fantasizing about unfulfilled promises. But her father's words, though spoken gently, revived a fear she had never named. If no one ever chose her in her lifetime, would she truly exist? The morning passed like any other. Margaret brought hay for the horses, repaired a loose section of the fence, and recorded expenses in her old ledger. Everything proceeded in its usual order. But in each small action something had changed subtly, like a change in the wind that only those who have lived long enough on the pastures can notice. By midday the sun was higher. Margaret sat resting in the shade of a birch tree, a glass of water in her hand. She thought about the morning's remark, not with anger but with quiet questioning. Her father didn't hate her. He just didn't believe life could offer her anything more than what she already had. And perhaps the most painful thing isn't being criticized but being defined and judged while you're still breathing. Margaret stood up, brushing the dust off her dress. She didn't know that this morning, though it had begun with a cold remark, would be the start of something she had never dared to imagine. But before anyone saw her differently, Margaret would have to pass through a more familiar place, a place where she was always, but had never been asked how she felt. And it was during those busy days when all eyes were on others that Margaret's loneliness began to become more apparent than ever. The town of Clearwater Junction, Montana has never been this crowded. Lydia Moore's wedding, the youngest sister in the family, drawn people from farms, dozens of miles away, to the small square beside the wooden church. Horse-drawn carriages lined the streets, laughter and conversation mingled with the aroma of freshly baked pastries and hot coffee. It was late spring, with a gentle breeze enough to make the white ribbons on the gate flutter softly. Anna Moore arrived earlier than everyone else. She tied the tablecloth, adjusted each chair, and reminded the children not to run into the kitchen. Her hands were accustomed to such tasks, neat, precise, without unnecessary movements. If anyone looked closely, they would see that Anna never stood still for too long. She always found something to do, as if even a moment's pause would allow a feeling of emptiness to overwhelm her. In the kitchen behind the church, Anna was the silent commander. She knew which pots needed more water, which cakes needed to be served at the right time. When an elderly relative complained of fatigue, Anna pulled out a chair for her. When strangers asked for directions, Anna smiled and offered guidance. She did it all with the composure of someone accustomed to staying in the background. No one asked Anna if she was happy. Actually, they didn't intentionally forget. On days like these, the town only has room for the bride and groom and the congratulations. Anna, the eldest unmarried sister, was simply part of the background, like the wooden wall behind the church, always there without needing to be mentioned. As the ceremony began, Anna stood at the back door. She didn't go inside immediately. From there, she saw Lydia in her simple white dress, her trembling hand resting on the hand of the man who would spend the rest of her life with her. The music played slow and solemn. Anna isn't jealous. She felt a void open up inside her, so vast she didn't know how to fill it. Not because her sister was getting married, but because that moment made her realize life has doors that open for others while she remains standing at the same old threshold. After the ceremony, everyone rushed out into the courtyard. The laughter and chatter grew louder and more relaxed. Lydia was surrounded by blessings. Anna carried the tray of cakes to the long table under the maple tree. A middle-aged woman patted her hand gently. "Thank you, Anna. Without you, we would have been in complete chaos." Anna smiled and nodded. The thank you didn't upset her. It only reminded her that her role was always clear: the planner, the one behind the scenes, the one who lets things run smoothly for others. The afternoon passed quickly. The sun rose high, its rays filtering through the leaves, creating shimmering patches of light on the ground. Anna stood in the church window looking out at the courtyard where people were dancing. Lydia smiled radiantly, her face beaming, as if she had finally found her rightful place in the world. Anna stood there for a long time. She didn't cry. There was no reason to cry. It was a beautiful day, a day that should be remembered with joy. But in that moment, Anna suddenly understood that the feeling of being left behind in life didn't need tears. It only needed a doorway and enough time for someone to stand and watch. For a moment, Lydia turned to look for her sister. Her gaze briefly flicked over Anna, then was drawn away by another call. Anna raised her hand and waved gently as if to reassure her that she was still there. And she really was there, just as always. As evening approached, people began to leave. Anna tidied up the tables and chairs, folded the tablecloths, and washed the dishes in the fading light. She worked until only a few fallen leaves remained in the yard and the scent of pastries lingered in the air. When everything had calmed down, Anna sat down on the church steps. The wind carried the chill of the evening. She pulled her scarf tighter around her shoulders. In that rare stillness, for the first time that day, Anna allowed herself to think about the question no one had ever asked her. Has anyone ever seen me, not because I'm useful but because I'm myself? That question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It just sits there quietly, like the dirt roads leading out of Clearwater Junction. Few notice, yet it exists, waiting for someone to step onto them. And as Anna rose, brushed the dust off her dress, and prepared to leave in the fading twilight, she was completely unaware that a man outside the Moore family's narrative had begun to take notice of the woman the town had always seen through. The man arrived in Hawthorne Bend in late summer, when the cattle wagons were beginning to thin out and the town was returning to its usual slow pace. He wasn't there for a wedding, nor for a festival. He was there for a deal to buy hay, something his farm north needed urgently before winter arrived. His name is Jonah Reed. Jonah owned Silver Ridge Ranch, located about a day's horse ride from Hawthorne Bend. He wasn't one to frequent town. He preferred to stay by the pastures, to the misty mornings and windy evenings, through the barns. He was known as a respectable, quiet man who always paid his fair share. That day, Jonah went to the community shed to finish some paperwork. The remnants of the previous day's gathering still lingered. A few chairs hadn't been put away and the smell of baked goods still hung in the air. He leaned against a wooden post, waiting for the person in charge to arrive. And it was there that he saw Clara Bennett. This is not the time for her to be alone. This is not the time for her to step into the spotlight. Jonah noticed Clara when a child knocked over a bucket of water, and she was the first to bend down, calming the child, while quickly wiping the floor to prevent anyone from slipping. He saw her when an elderly man struggled with a heavy stroller, and she approached without saying much, simply placing her hand where it was needed. Clara wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't hasty. In every movement there was a rare calmness, something Jonah was used to noticing in experienced people. He didn't approach. He just stood there, observing as he always did with his livestock, before deciding which animals needed to be separated and which should stay. For a brief moment things became chaotic when the person in charge of paperwork arrived late, and some people started complaining. Jonah saw Clara standing in the middle of the group. She didn't try to calm them down with words. She just said a short, clear sentence, then set about rearranging things, and strangely enough, everyone followed. Jonah realized this before he could even think of a name for it. Clara brought with her a kind of order that needed no commands. The deal was concluded quickly. When Jonah finished signing, he looked up. Clara had left. He didn't ask anyone about her. Not because he wasn't curious, but because he was used to letting things unfold naturally. That evening Jonah stayed in Hawthorne Bend. He had dinner at the small inn by the railroad tracks where the oil lamps cast warm patches of light on the wooden tables. He sat alone as usual. Someone mentioned Clara's name in the conversation next to it. Not as a main topic, just a fleeting remark. That girl is always there. I don't know where she gets the energy from. Jonah didn't turn around to look, but he listened. He had been a widower for nearly 8 years. Mary Reed died in a winter colder than usual. There was no drama, no last words, just a prolonged illness and a quiet passing just as she had lived. After that, Jonah didn't seek anyone else out. Not because no one had approached him, but because he knew that a heart that had truly loved wouldn't easily open up just to fill a void. Mary was that kind of woman. Quiet, steadfast, always knew what she needed to do even when everything around her was chaotic. Jonah wasn't comparing Clara to Mary. He was simply recognizing a familiar quality, like when one hears an old melody again without needing to remember the song's name. The next morning Jonah returned to the barn for a final check of the hay. Clara was there. This time they stood closer together. Jonah greeted her with a nod. Clara returned the gesture. There were no unnecessary pleasantries. When a bale of hay ripped, Clara bent down to tie it back together. Jonah stepped in to help. They worked side by side in silence. But it wasn't an awkward silence. It was the silence of two people accustomed to letting actions speak louder than words. Before leaving, Jonah said something neither a compliment nor a polite remark. She kept this place standing. Clara paused slightly. She didn't know how to respond. Such words were rarely directed at her. She simply smiled faintly as if unsure if she had heard correctly. Jonah mounted his horse and left Hawthorne Bend. But as the dirt road stretched out before him, he knew he would turn back. Not for the hay. But for a woman there, a woman the whole town was used to seeing right through, but he wasn't. And it was from that seemingly unintentional remark that Clara's old beliefs began to crumble, not because of new hope, but because, for the first time, her value was being called by its true name. The afternoon in Willow Creek, Nebraska dragged on slowly, as it always did. The late afternoon sun slanted down the low rooftops, casting a soft, gentle yellow hue over the town, so soothing that one could forget the time. Everything seemed to have returned to its familiar order after the busy days, and Ruth Calder was no exception. Ruth stood in the grocery store room behind the general store, checking the inventory. She did this regularly, without needing any prompting. Every number, every note, was in its proper place, as if order was the only thing that kept her grounded in a life that rarely questioned its importance. When Henry Walsh entered, Ruth didn't look up immediately. She was used to people coming and going, bringing requests, questions, or complaints. Henry stood there for a moment, watching Ruth take notes, how she paused to think, then continued unhurriedly. He didn't say anything right away. Only when Ruth put down her pen and turned around did Henry speak, his voice low and slow, as if he had been considering it for a long time. "You know," he said, "you keep this whole place running, and hardly anyone notices." The words weren't spoken loudly. They weren't said to impress. But they made Ruth stand still. She smiled, a familiar, gentle, and somewhat defensive smile. The smile of someone who had learned not to believe that good things come too easily. "You're exaggerating," Ruth replied, her voice polite. "I'm just doing my job." Henry did not object. He did not repeat the statement. He simply nodded, as if he did not need anyone to agree with the truth he had just stated. Ruth returned to her work, but her hands moved a beat slower. Not because she was emotional, but because for years no one had ever given a proper name to what she did. People were used to taking it for granted, and she was used to seeing it as a duty, nothing more. The afternoon continued to drag on. Ruth closed her notebook, hung up her keys, and stepped outside. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and damp earth. She walked along the main road of Willow Creek, where people were used to seeing her as part of the scene, always there, unnoticed. Henry's words didn't make her happy, but they didn't disappear either. They remained quietly, like a tiny crack in the wall of belief Ruth had long built around herself, that her value lay only in her usefulness, nothing more. That evening Ruth sat alone in the small room behind the shop. She lit an oil lamp, its pale yellow light casting a soft glow on the wooden walls. She thought about the saying, not to find its deeper meaning, but to understand why it bothered her so much. Because if those words were true, if what she did truly had value, then her old beliefs would no longer hold true. And change for Ruth was never easy. The next morning Ruth met Henry at the small dock near the town. He was preparing goods for shipment. They greeted each other with a familiar nod. Neither repeated the words from the previous day, but Ruth noticed that in Henry's eyes there was no pity, only acknowledgement, calm, undemanding. That confused Ruth more than any compliment. In the following days, she began to notice the little things, the way Henry waited for her to finish speaking before responding, the way he asked her opinion on things that people used to decide for themselves. There was no coercion, no expectation of reciprocation. And it was this lack of demands that began to scare Ruth, because hope, when it arrives late, is often more terrifying than loneliness. One evening when the town was quiet, Ruth stood in front of the shop looking out at the deserted street. She wondered if I believed him what would happen, not to Henry, but to herself. The question didn't need an immediate answer, but it was there. And Ruth knew from that moment on she could never fully return to her old beliefs. And it was when a simple remark shook Ruth's familiar world that a new fear began to emerge. The fear that if hope were to be rekindled, she would no longer have the courage to endure another disappointment. Autumn arrives in Ashford Crossing, Wyoming, with mornings that are colder than usual. Dew settles on the wooden fences, and the sound of trains passing through town seems more distant, as if the sounds themselves are retreating to make way for silence. Eliza Monroe stood on the porch folding the shawl that had been hanging out to dry the night before. She worked slowly, not out of fatigue, but because her mind was preoccupied with thoughts that wouldn't stay still. Lately, she had noticed, she often paused midway between a familiar action, between a thought that was otherwise perfectly clear. Ever since that afternoon when Caleb Thornton made that remark to her, a remark that sounded anything but a compliment, Eliza knew that her world had cracked open a tiny fissure. No one else noticed, but Eliza did. Caleb didn't come to Ashford Crossing often. He had a farm to the south where the land was spacious and the wind blew freely, unobstructed by houses. When he did show up, things were usually quieter, no noise, no attention-grabbing. Eliza was used to seeing him as part of the business, a person to meet, a deal to be done, until that morning. Caleb arrived early, waiting outside the gate while Eliza was still checking the books. He took off his hat, holding it in his hand as if he didn't want to bring anything that might make the conversation more difficult. "Eliza," he said, his voice slow and low, "if you don't mind, I'd like to ask permission to visit. Not for work." The words didn't startle Eliza. In fact, she knew this moment would come. What stunned her wasn't the offer, but the palpable sense of fear that welled up in her chest. She didn't answer immediately. In Eliza's mind, the fear of queuing and order was terrifying. She thought of Samuel Monroe, her father, the man who had been accustomed to deciding everything in the house, from the planting season to the unspoken rules. She knew what he would say if he knew Caleb was visiting. Not because he hated Caleb, but because he didn't want to lose control. She thought of the townspeople's stares, of the familiar whispers, of the possibility that people would assume Caleb was just kind, or worse, pitiful. And most of all, Eliza was afraid of herself. She feared that if she allowed hope to enter even just once, when it left, she would no longer have the strength to return to the peace she had built over the years. "Eliza," Caleb asked again without rushing. She took a slow breath. Then she said something she herself didn't expect. "I'm sorry," Eliza said, her voice even not trembling. "Not now." Caleb didn't ask for the reason. He didn't press the matter. He simply nodded as if he had anticipated the answer. "Then never mind," he replied. "Thank you for being honest." He put on his hat and turned away. There was no sign of disappointment, no promise to return. Just acceptance, complete, unconditional. Eliza stood there for a long time after Caleb left. She was surprised that the feeling in her heart wasn't relief but a very quiet sadness, not a sharp pain, just a lingering ache, like when one realizes they've just rejected something that could have changed their life. In the days that followed, Caleb didn't appear. No letters, no messages. Ashford Crossing returned to its old rhythm, and so did Eliza. She worked, tended to the farm, and remained silent, as she always did best. But something has changed. That evening, as Eliza sat alone by the window, she realized she was no longer afraid of hope as before. Instead, she began to fear a life she would never dare to try. She recalled how Caleb left, not angrily, not reproachfully, just respectfully. And in that memory, Eliza understood one thing: for the first time she had been given a choice, and that choice had been accepted. That's what caused her fear to take on a different form. One morning, before the mist had completely lifted, Eliza heard the sound of a horse stopping at the gate. She didn't need to look to know who it was, but this time she wasn't in a hurry. She stepped out onto the porch. Caleb stood there, keeping his distance. He hadn't come to ask about the same thing again. He'd come to deliver an item, a forgotten notebook. "She left it behind the other day," he said. Eliza accepted it. They stood still for a moment. No one said anything more. But in that silence, Eliza realized Caleb's patience wasn't about waiting for her consent, it was about waiting for her to be ready for herself. And while Eliza was still considering whether she had the courage to speak up, she had no idea that behind her another man who was accustomed to making decisions for her was beginning to notice that small but dangerous change. Because when a woman begins to think about choosing her own happiness, that's when the old power structures feel threatened. Evenings in dry Hollow, Nebraska often arrive very early. As the sun sets behind the low hills, the air begins to cool, and the wind whistling through the cracks in the wooden doors sounds like the ancient whispers of this land. Margaret Sloane was tidying the kitchen when she heard the sound of a chair being dragged across the floor. She didn't need to turn to know her father had returned. Edgar Sloane always made a noise when he entered a room, not because he wanted to be loud, but because he was used to being the center of attention. He placed his hat on the table, hung up his coat, and sat down. He said nothing immediately. Margaret continued with her work, placing the dishes on the shelf and wiping her hands on her apron. She waited. Important conversations in this house always began that way, with waiting. "I heard," Edgar said finally, his voice low and firm, "that there's a man who's been coming around here lately." Margaret paused for a very brief moment. Then she turned facing her father. She neither denied nor explained. "Yes," she said. "Just talking." Edgar looked at his daughter. His eyes held the worry Margaret had expected. They held a calculating look, something a man who had run the farm for decades couldn't hide. "I know what you're thinking, Father," he continued. "People like that, they won't stay." The words were spoken slowly, as if they were an undeniable truth, proven by time. Edgar didn't need to raise his voice. He knew the weight of his words. Margaret sat down in the chair opposite. She felt a tightness in her heart, not from fear, but from familiarity. She had heard similar things her whole life. Not to hurt her, but to keep things in place. "I don't want you to get your hopes up and then be disappointed," Edgar added, as if to complete his role. Margaret looked at her father's calloused hands, resting on the wooden table worn smooth by the years. He had spent his whole life building Dry Hollow. He had lost a lot, and in the process, he had learned a lesson: anything uncontrollable should be avoided. But what Edgar didn't say, and perhaps didn't even realize, was that his real fear wasn't about Margaret being abandoned. He was afraid. "We lost a worker, someone who knew every corner of the kitchen, every plot of land. He lost the power of decision-making, the very thing that had helped him survive. Losing his position, the man around whom everything revolves. If you leave," Edgar said, his voice lower, "who will take care of this place?" That question didn't need an answer. It was an invisible thread that had bound Margaret there for all those years. Margaret remained silent. She didn't object, not because she agreed, but because she understood that any resistance at this moment would be seen as ingratitude. That night Margaret lay in bed watching the wooden ceiling darken. Her father's words, "Men like him don't stay," echoed in her head, not as a warning but as a seed of doubt sown where she had just dared to hope. She thought of Thomas Blake, the man who had waited, who had respected her refusal. But then she wondered, would that respect last? That question didn't come from her experience with Thomas. It came from her father's voice, the voice that had shaped her world for 40 years. The next morning, Margaret went about her work as usual. She said nothing about the previous night's conversation. Neither did Edgar. In the Sloane household, the most important things were always left unaddressed, not brought up again. But in every little action, the way Margaret lingered longer at the door, the way she gazed out at the dirt road leading away from Dry Hollow, something was shifting. Edgar noticed that change, and that made him uneasy, because he understood very well when a woman begins to think about leaving, the old power cannot maintain its original form. He said no more. But in his silence there was another warning, not for Margaret but for anyone who dared to step into the world he had controlled for so long. And from the moment the father speaks to retain his power, the story ceases to be just between two people. It becomes a silent confrontation between the past and a future that is trying to take shape. The town of Ridgway Flats, Montana, has a habit of speaking in voices just low enough so that no one is held accountable for what they say. Here, important things are rarely spoken aloud. They drift between stalls, follow church services, and linger in kitchen corners where people think no one will hear. Helen Parker knew that from a very young age. She grew up in Ridgeway Flats, living there long enough to understand that the town doesn't change how it sees a person just because that person wants to be. People remember who you are, and they hold on to that memory tightly. Lately, Helen has felt the atmosphere around her has changed. It's not that anyone is treating her badly. On the contrary, everyone is still polite. They still nod in greeting. But in the gaps between conversations, something quiet is subtly spreading. Helen first heard it at the grocery store. She was choosing flour when she overheard two women talking behind her. Their voices were just low enough, but in the quiet room, every sound carried further than one might think. "He's just being kind," one person said. "He probably felt sorry for her," another replied. Helen stood still. Her hand remained on the sack of flour. No one called her name. No one looked directly at her. But she knew they were talking about her. She didn't turn back. Not out of shame, but because she was too used to it. In Ridgeway Flats, stories like this don't need direct confrontation. They exist through repetition. On the way home, Helen heard a few more similar snippets. At the waterfront, near the stables, in the fleeting glances of people she had known her whole life. "They say he's a good man, but men like that don't stay." Helen recognized the words. They were exactly like what her father had said, and just like hearing them from her father's mouth, they carried a fear that didn't belong to her, the fear of those who don't believe in change. That afternoon, Helen stopped by the church to deliver some bread. She heard a low chuckle behind her. No malice, no mockery. Just the certainty of people who believed they knew more about the situation than the insiders. Helen didn't cry. She wasn't angry. The feeling that came over her was a profound weariness, like when one realizes they are standing before a wall that cannot be explained or broken down. That evening she sat alone in her small house on the edge of town. The oil lamp burned steadily. Outside, the wind blew across the dry meadow. Helen thought of Jacob Miller, the man who had treated her with rare respect, but then she wondered, would that respect withstand these voices? That question wasn't posed by Jacob. It was sown by Ridgeway Flats, by a community accustomed to viewing things through an old lens. The next day, Helen met Jacob at the post office. He greeted her as usual. No change, no sign of embarrassment, but Helen realized she was different. She heard the words in her head even before he spoke. "What did they say?" Jacob asked, as if he sensed something. Helen shook her head, not because she didn't want to speak, but because she didn't know how to say it properly. Whispers aren't easy to recount. They have no clear form, but they are heavy. Jacob didn't press the matter. He simply nodded, maintaining a distance sufficient so Helen wouldn't feel pulled away. In the following days, Helen began to avoid crowded places, not out of embarrassment, but because she needed quiet time to understand what she was afraid of. She feared that if Jacob stayed, people would say he pitied her. She feared that if he left, people would say they were right. And most of all, she feared that both of those things could be true in the town's eyes, regardless of the truth. One afternoon, as Helen stood by the riverbank, she heard a familiar voice behind her. It wasn't gossip. It was her own voice, clearly audible. "I can't spend my whole life proving myself to them." That thought didn't bring her any relief, but it gave her a different perspective. Perhaps the important thing wasn't to change the way the town thought, but to prevent their voices from becoming the voices in her own head. When Helen returned, she knew she would face an even harder choice ahead. It wasn't just a choice about Jacob. It was a choice about whether she dared to trust her own feelings, even if the community denied them. And it was when the collective voice of prejudice rang out most clearly that Helen began to understand that the real battle wasn't in the town, but in the long night of doubt that awaited her. Night in Coldwater Ridge, Wyoming comes slowly, not because it's not yet dark, but because the wind refuses to stop blowing. The late autumn winds sweep through the valley, carrying the scent of damp earth and dry grass, making every sound clearer than usual, the gentle rattling of windows, the crackling of wood in the cold. Martha Ellison sat at the small table. By the window, an oil lamp resting between her hands. The weak yellow light illuminated her face accustomed to silence. Outside, the town of Coldwater Ridge was asleep, but in this room a long night was beginning. Martha wasn't young anymore. She knew that better than anyone. She'd lived long enough to understand that good things, when they come late, often leave more questions than answers. She thought about Jonathan Price. He did nothing wrong. On the contrary, he did everything so properly that it was difficult to find a reason to refuse him. He waited. He respected. He didn't demand. But it was precisely that on a night like this that frightened Martha. Because, in her mind, one question kept repeating itself slowly but refusing to go away. What if he chooses me? Only out of pity, Martha closed her eyes. She had heard the town's whispers. She was used to how people viewed her as a devoted, valuable woman, but not the chosen one. If Jonathan stayed, the town would have its own explanation: he's kind. And if he left, they'd say, see, it all came back the same way. Both of those possibilities were exhausting for Martha. She stood up, walked to the small bookshelf, and took out a piece of paper and a pen. She didn't intend to write a letter. At least that's what she told herself. But as she sat down, her hand began to move, as if it had been waiting for this moment for a long time. She wrote to Jonathan. Not a reproach, not a plea, just things she'd never said. She feared being chosen for kindness, not for desire. She was used to standing alone, and hope confused her. She needed to know, not now but someday, why he was staying. Martha wrote slowly. She paused several times, as if considering each word. When the letter was finished, she folded it carefully. But she didn't put it in an envelope. She left the letter on the table, not sent. Because there are fears that, when written down, are enough to make one breathe a sigh of relief without needing to share them with anyone else. The night passed. The wind subsided. Martha sat there for a long time, gazing at the small flame in the oil lamp. She realized a truth that filled her with both sadness and serenity. She feared Jonathan leaving not as much as he staying for the wrong reasons. The next morning, light streamed into the room very early. Martha got up, folded the letter, and put it in the drawer. She didn't burn it, nor did she send it. It was there as a part of the truth she wasn't ready to share yet. She went outside and took a deep breath of the cold air. Coldwater Ridge woke up slowly. Everything looked the same as usual. But Martha knew that after last night she was no longer the same. She dared to ask the most difficult question, and she dared to accept that there was no completely safe answer. When Martha met Jonathan at noon, he greeted her, as usual. There was no sign that he knew anything about the long night that had passed. And that made Martha realize something else. She still had time, not to run away, but to face the truth. Because after a night of doubt, she would either close herself off, or she would allow the truth to take another step forward, this time not in silence. And just as Martha was considering whether she should speak the words she had written but never sent, another man, one who was not one to back down, was preparing to answer that doubt with action, not words. The morning at Ironwood Pass, Montana, began with a fog so thick that people had to slow down, more than usual. The old pine trees stood motionless, like witnesses all too familiar with the comings and goings of people, each carrying their own hopes and disappointments. Nathan Cole rode his horse along the dirt road to Stonefield Farm before sunrise. He wasn't in a hurry, but each step of the horse carried a clear certainty, as if he had made the decision long ago, and this morning was simply the time to act on it. Stonefield Farm belonged to Walter Finch, a man who had lived long enough to believe he understood the world better than anyone else. Walter wasn't a bad person. He was just used to making decisions for others, especially his own daughter. When Nathan dismounted at the gate, Walter was already waiting. He wasn't surprised. News from Ironwood Pass always spread faster than the wind. "I knew you'd come," Walter said, his voice dry but not hostile. "Come in." They sat opposite each other in the simple living room. Light streamed through the window onto the worn wooden table. There was no tea, no social pleasantries. Walter wasn't one for beating around the bush. "What do you want?" he asked. Nathan took off his hat and placed it on the table. He looked directly at Walter without flinching. "I've come to make myself clear," Nathan replied, his voice slow and firm. "I choose Abigail Finch." Walter smirked. "Choose." He repeated the word, as if it had a different meaning in someone else's mouth. You know what kind of girl she is, don't you? Nathan nodded. I know. Not pretty. Not charming. Not the type of woman men usually choose, Walter said, not sarcastically, just stating the facts. Nathan didn't immediately object. He let the silence linger for a moment, then said, I don't need a beautiful woman. I need a good woman. The words fell into the room like a stone placed in the right spot. Quiet, but impossible to lift easily. Walter stared at Nathan for a long time. In his eyes, there was no longer the initial suspicion but a deeper unease, for he realized this wasn't a man who had come out of fleeting emotion. Who do you think you are to say those things? Walter asked. Do you think you understand her better than I do? Nathan shook his head. No. I only understand myself, he recounted in a monotone voice, without trying to persuade, that there were other women, more socially acceptable, younger, more charming, considered by many to be the safe choice, that he had been advised to choose them, and that he had refused. It wasn't out of contempt. Rather, he knew he wouldn't spend his whole life making choices solely to please others. I didn't come here because I lacked options, Nathan said. I came because I've already made my choice. Walter leaned back in his chair. He felt something both familiar and unsettling at the same time. This wasn't the young man who had come to ask permission. This was an equal, and that deprived him of his familiar advantage. And what if she refuses? Walter asked, as a final blow. Nathan nodded. I will respect that. That answer silenced Walter, because it took away both things he used to control things, pressure and fear. The conversation ended not with agreement but with an uncomfortable, unspoken understanding. Nathan put on his hat and stood up. I didn't come here to fight, he said before leaving. I came to take responsibility for my choices. As Nathan left Ironwood Pass, the fog had lifted. The road became clearer. He knew the hardest part wasn't facing Walter but letting Abigail make her own decision. Meanwhile, at Stonefield, Abigail stood by the window, completely unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. But she sensed a shift in the atmosphere, as if something had been said for her, without taking away her right to choose. And when a man doesn't back down from old prejudices and power structures, the next question is no longer whether he stays, but whether the woman dares to choose herself, for the first time. Because after being clearly and properly chosen, Abigail will have to face the question she has never been asked in her life. What do you really want? The afternoon in Meadow Ridge, Nebraska cast a pale gray over the harvested fields. It wasn't raining, but the wind carried a chill, a warning that winter was imminent. In her small log cabin on the edge of town, Clara Whitmore was sorting through the drying linen. She worked alone as usual. Clara's life had never been noisy. It unfolded in repetitive actions, cooking, sewing, keeping records, caring for others. She did it so well that no one remembered to ask if she wanted to do it. When Ethan Brooks arrived, there was a very soft knock on the door. Clara opened it and found him standing there, hat in hand. He didn't come in immediately. He just stood on the porch as if to ensure that his presence wouldn't disrupt the already peaceful atmosphere. Are you free today? Ethan asked. Clara nodded. She let him in. They sat opposite each other, between a small, old wooden table. Light from the window shone on Ethan's face, revealing the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, the marks of someone who had lived long enough not to say what he didn't mean. They were silent for a moment. Then Ethan asked, not loudly, not urgently, but so clearly that Clara couldn't avoid it. Clara, what do you want? The question hung suspended in the air, as if the room itself had to pause to listen. Clara opened her mouth, then closed it again. She was used to answering other questions, how much is needed, when, where. But this question was different. It wasn't seeking information, it was seeking truth. She looked down at her hands, hands accustomed to working, to serving, to bearing burdens. For years Clara had never thought she had the right to want something for herself. She began, then stopped. Ethan didn't rush. He waited. In that moment Clara heard the voices of the past. Her father's voice, the town's voice, the voices of the years that had taught her that desire was a luxury. But she also heard another voice, smaller but persistent, her own. I want, Clara said slowly, as if learning a new language. I want to see. Not as a useful person, not as a duty, but as a complete human being. Ethan didn't smile. He didn't nod immediately. He just looked at Clara, really looked, and in his eyes, there was no pity, no triumph. Only acknowledgement. Clara took a deep breath. She didn't cry, but her shoulders trembled slightly, as if her body was adjusting to a truth that had just been revealed. "I don't know what that means for the future," she continued, "but I know, if I don't say it today, I might never be able to say it again." Ethan nodded very slightly. "That's enough," he said, "for today." The conversation ended without a promise. No immediate decision was made. But as Ethan stood up to leave, Clara realized one thing: she had chosen him before anyone else. In the evening, Clara sat by the window watching the fields gradually sink into darkness. Everything looked the same, but inside a door had opened, not loudly, not brightly, just enough to let in some light. She knew that from this moment on every subsequent choice would be different. Not because of Ethan, not because of the town, but because she had heard her own voice and couldn't pretend she hadn't heard it. And as Clara stood taller in the silence of the late afternoon, another moment awaited, a moment where the outside world would see what she had just dared to name. Evenings in Cedar Hollow, Wyoming, carry a distinctly frontier chill, not harsh, but enough to make one pull up their collar and slow their pace. Oil lamps from the small wooden hall in the town center cast a warm glow on the ground, creating a comforting halo of light amidst the deepening shadows. Tonight is community gathering night. It was a familiar evening at Cedar Hollow. There was violin music, a few old dance tunes, hot coffee, and conversations that repeated themselves year after year. No one expected anything new, and so Ellen Mayfield's arrival subtly changed the atmosphere of the room. Ellen entered with Thomas Rowe. She wasn't wearing a new dress. The dark blue dress, patched many times, clung to her familiar slender figure. Her hair was neatly tied back, simple, not concealing anything. Ellen wasn't trying to look different, but as she walked in, one thing was undeniable: she stood much straighter than before. Thomas held her hand. Not a reassuring grip, not a pulling or leading. Just a hand placed in the right spot, firm, calm, like an unspoken affirmation. The conversations in the hall slowed down, not stopped completely, just shifted slightly. People looked, people whispered. They compared the scene before them to images they had been familiar with for years. Ellen knew it. She felt the gazes on her from all sides. But unlike before, when she usually bowed her head seeking a secluded corner, this time she didn't flinch. She took a slow breath, maintained a steady rhythm, and continued walking. Thomas didn't let go of her hand. When the first piece of music began to play, he turned and asked very softly, "Would you like to?" Ellen nodded, without hesitation. Without looking around for an escape route, they stepped onto the dance floor. Ellen wasn't a great dancer. She knew that. But Thomas wasn't leading to show off. He danced slowly at just the right tempo so Ellen wouldn't feel like a burden. They weren't trying to be the center of attention. They were just there enough for everyone to see. An elderly woman standing near the wall tilted her head slightly as she looked at Ellen. It wasn't a look of contempt. It was the look of someone who had lived long enough to understand that courage isn't always loud. Ellen felt a slight tremor in her hands, not from fear but because her body was learning a new posture, the posture of someone who no longer asks permission to exist. She didn't become more beautiful under those lights, but something changed noticeably. She no longer seemed smaller in the eyes of others. The music ended. Thomas didn't let go of her hand. They weren't in a hurry to leave the dance floor. They just stood there for a moment, long enough for Cedar Hollow to understand that this presence wasn't accidental, not a spur-of-the-moment gesture. Conversations resumed, but the tone was different. The old whispers are gone. Not because prejudice has disappeared, but because it is no longer strong enough to impose itself on those who stand tall. Ellen and Thomas sat down at a wooden table in the corner of the hall. Some people greeted them, others simply nodded. No one apologized for the years they had treated her as if she didn't exist. Ellen didn't need it anyway. She just sat there, her hands on the table, her back straight, her eyes calm. Thomas leaned over and whispered, "If you want to go home early, I'll give you a ride." Ellen shook her head. "Not yet," she replied. "I'm fine." And that's not something said to please anyone. It's the truth. When they left Cedar Hollow that evening, it was colder. Ellen stepped outside, feeling the night air touch her face. Everything was the same, but in her footsteps there was a new rhythm, the rhythm of someone who had been acknowledged first and foremost by herself. And it was in the silence, following a night of standing tall in the community, that Ellen began to understand that subsequent promises didn't need to be flowery. They just needed to be genuine enough to live on. Winter arrives in Pine Creek Valley, Montana, in a very quiet way. There are no fierce blizzards, just colder mornings, bare branches, and the ground hardening underfoot. Life in this valley has never been easy, but it has always been honest, like the people who have chosen to stay. Sarah Langford was folding an old woolen blanket when she heard a knock at the door. Not hurried, not surprising. She was used to the slow pace of life in Pine Creek, where everything happened at its proper time. When she opened the door, William Hodge stood there, hat in hand, his breath escaping into the cold air. He hadn't brought flowers, nor was there a small box in his coat pocket. Only the gaze of a man who had thought carefully before taking a step from which there was no turning back. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and calm, "can you spare me a few minutes?" She nodded and invited him in. They sat opposite each other at a wooden table near the fireplace. The firelight cast shadows on the walls, creating slow patches of light and shadow like the rhythm of the house breathing. William didn't speak immediately. He set his hat down, clasped his hands together as if needing to keep them still so the words wouldn't be carried away. "I've thought about it a lot," he began. "Not about whether we're compatible, but about whether I'm honest enough to live with you." Sarah listened. She didn't smile. She wasn't nervous. She just listened as she had learned over the years, knowing that the most important words are often spoken slowly. "I can't promise easy days," William continued. "Here, you know, the winters are long, the land is barren, and people aren't perfect." He paused for a moment. "But I can promise honest days." Sarah looked at him. She saw no pretense in his eyes. No attempt to make the proposal seem more beautiful than it actually was. Just a complete acceptance of what life would bring. William didn't kneel. He didn't ask a dramatic question. He simply said, "If you agree, I want us to build a life together." Slowly, honestly, and without pretense. Sarah was silent for a long time. She thought about the years gone by, about the mornings waking up early for work, without anyone asking if she was tired, about the times she stood on the sidelines of other people's happiness, about the moment she learned to stand tall in the community. All of that didn't lead her to a romantic dream, it led her to a sober choice. "I don't need a perfect promise," Sarah said in the end. "I need someone who won't walk away when things get tough." William nodded. "I'm here," he replied. Nothing more. No rings were exchanged. No applause. Only a clear, unspoken understanding they chose each other not to escape loneliness, but to face life together. Outside, the wind blew through the valley. Pine Creek Valley continued its rhythm of life. Nothing noticeably changed. But inside that little house a decision had been made, quiet, unassuming, just enough to ensure its long-term survival. Sarah got up and poured herself more tea. When she returned to the table, she realized she was no longer searching for anything else. Not because all her questions had been answered, but because she had chosen a path she could follow to the end. And it is from that unpretentious marriage proposal that the story doesn't end happily ever after, but opens a new chapter where love no longer needs to be proven, only lived. Together, morning in Redwood Plain, Nebraska begins with a thin mist and the smell of damp wood. The sun rises slowly, as if it too doesn't want to disturb this rare moment of tranquility. Northfield Farm still stands there, old, familiar, and noticeably unchanged to an outsider. But for Hannah Cole this was her last morning. She stood on the porch, her hand resting on the weather-worn wooden post. She remembered every crack in the wall, every whistling sound of the wind through the gaps in the doors on long winter nights. Hannah had lived in Northfield almost her entire life, not as a daughter raised to leave, but as a part of this very land. She didn't tidy up much. Only a few sets of clothes, an old notebook, and a wooden spoon had accompanied her since her early days learning to cook. Everything else, the furniture, the sheds, the kitchen, would stay where it belonged. Hannah wasn't taking the past with her. She was simply laying it down with kindness. Her father, George Cole, stood on the steps behind her. He looked older than he had a few years ago. His back was slightly hunched, his steps slower, but his eyes still held that familiar hardened look, the look of a man who had lived his whole life without revealing his weakness. They don't talk much. Unnecessary. George didn't apologize. Hannah wasn't expecting one either, because some apologies, if they come too late, will only soothe the speaker's conscience, not heal the listener. "I'm leaving early," Hannah said, her voice calm. George nodded. "It's a long journey." "Yes, that's enough." Hannah stepped down the steps, her feet touching the cold morning ground. There were no tears, no anger, just one clear feeling: she no longer belonged here, and that didn't hurt her anymore. As the carriage rolled away, Hannah didn't look back. Not because she wanted to forget, but because there was no need to look back to prove she had been there. The road out of Redwood Plain ran through stubble-strewn fields past the small stream where Hannah used to stand for hours, washing clothes in the cold water. Everything passed by the carriage window like pages already read. No sadness, no regrets. Just the end. Samuel Wright was waiting ahead. Not in a special place. No flowers or greetings. He stood by the wooden fence, hand on his hat, the calm gaze of someone who had chosen to stay, not because there was nowhere else, but because this was where he wanted to build the rest of his life. When Hannah stepped out of the car, Samuel didn't say anything immediately. He just looked at her, not scrutinizing, not judging, as if he were greeting a complete person, not someone who had just escaped from something. "Are you all right?" he asked. Hannah nodded. "Okay, and that's true." The following days passed slowly in Clearbrook Valley. There were no dramatic moments, no grand pronouncements, just mornings of Hannah learning to adjust to a new rhythm of life, where no one dictated what she should do, no one decided anything for her. She still worked. She still woke up early. She still cooked, took notes, and managed her daily life. But one thing was different: she was no longer invisible in her own life. One afternoon, as Hannah stood by the stream watching the sunlight reflect on the water, she realized something very simple that would take a lifetime to understand. Not all flowers bloom in their proper season. There are some people who need more time to grow up, not because they are weak, but because the world is too busy to see them sooner. Hannah didn't blame her father. She didn't blame Redwood Plain. She didn't blame the years gone by. Each of those things was part of the path that had led her here, to a place where she could stand still without feeling superfluous. That evening, when the lights in the house were turned on, Samuel asked her if she had any regrets. Hannah thought for a moment. "No," she replied. "If things had been different sooner, I probably wouldn't be the person I am now." Samuel nodded. He understood. And in that comforting silence, Hannah knew that her story wouldn't end with marriage, a new home, or the recognition of others. It ends with a simple truth. There are people who blossom late in life, not because they're flawed, but because the world needs more time to learn how to see them properly. And when they are finally seen, they don't need to rush to prove anything anymore. They just need to live. Spring arrives later in Clearbrook Valley than in other places. It wasn't because the soil was infertile, but because the valley was low-lying. The cold wind lingered longer, and the snow melted slowly, as if nature itself wanted to test those who chose to stay. The last patches of ice on the stream banks only melted when the sun was a little higher, and the sparrows only returned when they were certain that winter had truly let go. Hannah Cole realized that in the first few mornings of her new life. She rose early as she had done all her life, but this time not out of obligation. There was no call from the old kitchen, no to-do list dictated by others. Only the faint light of dawn streaming through the small window, and a silence deep enough to hear her own breathing. Samuel Wright had woken up before her. He stood on the porch, straightening the wooden fence that had tilted after the long winter. No hurry, no complaint. Each hammer blow was firm, and even just as he had always lived. When Hannah came out, he simply nodded, a very slight smile, not the smile of someone proving something, but of someone content with their choice. They don't talk much in the morning, just short, practical sentences. "It's warmer now." "Yeah, the stream has thawed." But in those moments of silence there was something very different from Hannah's past. She no longer had to fill the silence to prove she was useful. The early days in Clearbrook Valley weren't easy. The small house Samuel used to live in alone needed repairs. The roof leaked in the corner of the kitchen. The north-facing window didn't close properly. Hannah didn't complain, nor did she see the repairs as a way to deserve her new place. She did it because it was shared life, nothing more, nothing less. Samuel let her decide for herself. That was what surprised Hannah the most. He didn't ask her what to do, nor did he dictate what she would do. When she said she wanted to plant a small vegetable patch behind the house, Samuel simply replied, "The soil there is good. You choose. Not, you should do it this way. Not, let me see. Just, you choose." There were evenings when the wind blew strongly through the valley. Hannah would sit by the fire and suddenly remember Redwood Plain. Not with intense sadness, just a gentle memory like an old thread still clinging to a garment. She missed her father, George Cole, and wondered how he managed in a house larger than it was. She felt no guilt for leaving, nor did she feel relieved by the escape. Just a quiet truth: some relationships can only heal when people stand far enough apart. Samuel didn't ask her if she missed home, but one evening as they sat mending an old coat, he said, "If you ever want to come back and visit, I'll go with you." Hannah looked up, not out of surprise, but because the statement came without conditions. "Thank you," she replied. "But not now." Samuel nodded. He didn't ask any further questions. Clearbrook Valley gradually got used to Hannah's presence. At first, people just looked. Then, they greeted me. Then they started asking very small questions. "Are you used to living here? Is the land suitable for you?" Hannah answered just enough. No evasion, no attempt to win favor. And strangely enough, it was precisely that composure that earned her more respect than any previous effort. A woman in the valley, a long-widowed woman, asked Hannah for help with bookkeeping. A young family asked her how to preserve food through the cold season. Hannah did these things with familiar skills, but with a new feeling. She was no longer a shadow in the background of other people's lives. One afternoon, as Hannah stood by the stream, watching the water flow more forcefully after the ice melted, she suddenly realized something she had never dared to think about before. Life doesn't need to make up for lost years. It just needs to live right from now on. Samuel came and stood beside her, silently gazing at the water. After a while he said, "Someone told me that. I'm late." Hannah smiled. "What do you think?" Samuel shrugged. "I think I've arrived at the right time for this life." Hannah didn't answer immediately, but deep down she felt a profound agreement. Because if there's one thing they both understand, it's this: being late doesn't mean being wrong. Spring has passed. Summer has arrived. Clearbrook Valley was greener, warmer. Hannah was beginning to adjust to the new rhythm, where each day required no proof, no permission to exist. She still worked hard, but the old weariness was gone, the weariness of someone living to fill someone else's void. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset over the valley, Samuel said slowly, "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know I don't want to live the rest of my life waiting for something else." Hannah looked at him. "Me too." There were no vows, no grand promises. These are just two people who have come far enough to understand that peace isn't a reward, it's the result of choosing the right people and the right way of life. And in Clearbrook Valley, amidst those very ordinary days, Hannah Cole came to understand something she had never before been allowed to think about. Life doesn't start anew when someone else chooses us. It starts when we stop seeing ourselves as latecomers. Autumn arrives in Clearbrook Valley with subtle changes. First, there's the light. Mornings are shorter, the sun rises later, and afternoons are a deeper yellow than in summer. Then there's the air, cooler, drier, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. Finally, there's the silence, not the silence of loneliness, but of a place accustomed to a slow pace of life. Hannah Cole realized autumn had truly arrived one morning when she opened the door and saw the first leaves falling all over the driveway in front of her house. She bent down to pick up a maple leaf that had turned a deep red. For a brief moment, she thought of Redwood Plain, where autumn used to be the busiest time, but also when old sayings came back to her most vividly. But this time, that memory didn't pull her back. It just flashed by. Samuel was repairing the barn roof when Hannah came out. He looked at the leaf in her hand and said, The season has arrived. Hannah nodded. That was quick. Samuel didn't ask any further questions. But when they ate lunch together afterward, he said, as if it were just a fleeting thought, "If anyone from Redwood Plain comes, I want you to know I'm here." Hannah paused for a moment. She didn't ask why he said that, because deep down she knew there are things that when one has lived peacefully enough, the past will find its way back to them. 3 days later, an old horse-drawn carriage stopped in front of the wooden fence of Clearbrook Valley. Hannah saw it from a distance. It wasn't because it was noisy. It was because there were images that even after so many years still felt so familiar. That car had driven countless times on the dirt roads of Northfield. And the man in the front seat, George Cole, was older than Hannah remembered. He got out of the car slowly. His back was more hunched. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the car's railing. Gone was the toughness that had once made Hannah feel small. But there was no obvious remorse either. Just an old man standing in a place where he didn't belong. Hannah stepped out. She didn't run. She didn't stop for too long. She walked with an upright posture and a steady gait. "Father," she said. George nodded. "Hannah." No one spoke for a few seconds. The wind blew through the valley, rustling the dry leaves beneath their feet. Samuel stood not far away, close enough for Hannah to know she wasn't alone, far enough for this encounter to belong to her. "I heard you've been here," George said finally. "For a while now." "Yes. Are you doing all right?" Hannah looked at the man before her. She had dreamed of this day many times, thought she would say a lot or nothing at all. But when the moment arrived, she saw only a profound calmness. "I'm fine," she replied. Nothing more. George nodded. He looked around Clearbrook Valley, the small house, the lumberyard, the valley opening up behind. Not magnificent, not wealthy. But one thing struck him immediately: his daughter was no longer living in a state of waiting. "Dad didn't come to embarrass you," George said. "I just wanted to know." Hannah tilted her head, waiting. "Do you resent your father?" The question wasn't asked as an apology. It was asked as something George wasn't sure he had the right to ask. Hannah thought for a moment. Not long, but deep enough. "No," she said. "I don't resent you." George looked at her a little surprised. "It's not because Dad was right," Hannah continued, her voice even and clear, "but because I don't need to carry that anymore. No tears, no reproaches. It's simply a truth spoken when the burden on the chest is no longer there." George bowed his head, very slightly. It wasn't a grand gesture of remorse, just the sign of someone realizing they're too late to fix the past, but still in time to avoid further hurt. "Father, I don't know how else to do it," he said almost to himself. Hannah neither denied nor confirmed it. "I know," she replied. "And I also know I lived differently." They stood there for a while longer. No one tried to prolong it. No one was in a hurry to end it. This meeting didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be enough. Before getting into the car, George turned back to look at Hannah. "You look different." Hannah smiled. "I'm no different. I just stand straighter." George said nothing more. He got into the carriage. The carriage turned around and left Clearbrook Valley along the narrow dirt road. Hannah watched until it disappeared behind the trees. Samuel walked over to her. "Are you all right?" he asked. Hannah took a deep breath. "Okay." And that's not reassurance. That evening Hannah sat alone by the fireplace. She thought about the recent encounter, not to analyze right from wrong, but to realize one thing very clearly. The past no longer controlled her emotions. Samuel brought her a cup of hot tea and placed it on the table. "You don't need to be strong," he said. "But you are." Hannah shook her head. "No, I'm not strong. I'm not a child anymore." Samuel understood. Outside, the autumn wind blew through the valley. Leaves continued to fall, but inside that little house, something had been accomplished, not with an apology, but with inner freedom. And when Hannah went to bed that night, she knew one thing for sure: the past only holds power when we still need it to define us. But when we have lived fully in the present, it is merely a path already traveled. Winter in Clearbrook Valley has been milder than usual this year. It wasn't because the weather had changed, but because Hannah Cole's perception of time had changed. She no longer counted the days by what she had to endure, but by what she had lived. The snow fell lightly, not heavily. Just enough white to cover the ground in a layer of tranquility, making the entire valley seem to enter a state of natural rest. Hannah stood by the window one early morning, watching the bird footprints in the snow. She realized she was no longer startled by the silence. Before, silence had been something she feared because it felt like being forgotten. Now silence was simply space to breathe. Samuel was building a fire outside the shed. He did everything slowly at his usual rhythm. Hannah watched him from afar and realized something she had never noticed before: he didn't live to be seen. He lived to do his job every day without an audience, and that in a very quiet way taught Hannah a new way of living. The winter days in Clearbrook Valley passed in a steady rhythm. Hannah sewed, took notes, and prepared food. Samuel repaired old items. They didn't need to say much. They didn't need constant confirmation that they were okay, because peace didn't need to be repeated in words. One afternoon, when the wind was blowing stronger than usual, Hannah brought firewood inside. Samuel looked at her and said softly, "You don't need to do it all." Hannah smiled. "I want to." And for the first time in my life, that statement didn't carry any request for permission or justification. It was simply a wish. Hannah started writing again. Not a diary of lamentations. Not notes of duty. She wrote about very small things: the weather, the trees, how the light changed with the seasons. She wrote not for anyone to read, just to put the days she had lived down on the page as a way of acknowledging that they had existed. There are some very short passages. "It's snowing today. I'm not sad. I miss Redwood Plain. But I don't want to go back. Perhaps I bloomed long ago, it's just that no one was there to see me." When winter passed, spring arrived again, this time without hesitation. Clearbrook Valley turned green again. The stream thawed. The birds returned. Hannah replanted the vegetable patch behind the house, her hands familiar with the soil, but her heart felt much lighter than before. No more thoughts of, "Is this good enough?" Only, "I am doing this, and I am here." One morning, a young woman from the neighboring valley came to see Hannah, asking her about how to keep the farm's accounts. Hannah instructed her slowly, without lecturing. The woman said, "I heard you've lived alone for a long time." Hannah smiled. "No. I've lived long enough to know what I need. Not a teaching, just a truthful statement." The woman nodded as if she had just received something she had never been told before. Samuel watched Hannah from afar, and in his provolé eyes was the reassurance of someone who knows that the best things in life don't need to be shown off. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel asked, "If no one saw us, would you be sad?" Hannah thought for a long time. Then she shook her head. "No," she replied. "I've lived my whole life, waiting to see it. Now, I just want to live." Samuel nodded. He didn't ask any further questions, because some answers, once stated, don't need further investigation. Hannah didn't become a prominent figure in Clearbrook Valley. No one wrote about her. No one praised her. But when people needed honest advice, they turned to her. When they needed a firm hand, they remembered her. And Hannah realized true value doesn't need the spotlight. Years later, when Hannah's hair had turned gray, when her pace had slowed, she still stood by the window each morning, watching the valley awaken. She didn't think about whether she had been chosen or not. She only knew she had lived her life to the fullest. One very late afternoon, Hannah sat down to write the final entry in her old notebook. "If someone were to ask me where my life began, I wouldn't say it started when someone chose me. I would say it started when I stopped believing I was late." She closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf. No one needed to read it. Samuel walked in and placed his hand on her shoulder. He said nothing. They stood there, watching the last rays of sunlight fade over the valley. And if anyone had passed by Clearbrook Valley that afternoon, they would have seen just two ordinary people, neither young nor remarkable, standing next to each other in silence. They won't know that before that came a lifetime of waiting. They won't know that there was a woman who was once told that no one would ever choose her. But that doesn't matter anymore, because Hannah Cole has blossomed without witnesses, without acknowledgement, without needing to prove anything further. And perhaps that is the most lasting form of happiness a person can attain in a lifetime. Not everyone who lives a good life leaves a clear mark. In Clearbrook Valley there are no stone monuments bearing Hannah Cole's name, No roads are named after her. And if you ask newcomers to the valley who Hannah was, many will simply answer, "Ah, she's a good listener." But that very quality over time became what kept Hannah around longer than any title. By the time Hannah reached an age where more than half of her hair was gray, Clearbrook Valley had changed. A few new houses had been built. A small school had been constructed near the stream. The children born there no longer knew the harsh winters of the past, but they still grew up in a slow-paced life where people were used to greeting each other by name. Hannah wasn't involved in the management. She wasn't in charge. She was just there. And the strange thing is, when one person stays there long enough, is kind enough, others will naturally seek them out. One early autumn afternoon, Eliza Morton, a young recently widowed woman, knocked on Hannah's door. Eliza didn't cry. She just stood there, clutching the hem of her dress, her eyes weary as if she hadn't yet understood why her life had taken such a different turn so soon. "I heard." "You understand," Eliza said, as if asking for permission. Hannah opened the door wider. "Come in." They sat at the wooden table where Hannah had sat hundreds of times with different people. Hannah didn't ask Eliza where to begin. She poured tea, pushed the cup forward, and let silence do its part. Eliza speaks very little. So does Hannah. But as Eliza stood up to leave, she stopped at the door, turned around and said, "I didn't hear you tell me to be strong." Hannah smiled. "Because you don't need to." Eliza nodded as if a heavy burden, one she herself couldn't name, had been lifted. Samuel watched from the porch. "She doesn't talk much," he said. Hannah replied, "Because sometimes people just need a place that doesn't get redone." In the following years the same thing happened again. A middle-aged man loses his farm to drought. A young boy doesn't want to follow in his father's footsteps. A woman always believes she's late to happiness. They didn't come to ask for advice. They came to sit beside someone who had survived without becoming bitter. Hannah never said she had the answer. But in the way she listens, unhurried, unjudgmental, there is something that allows others to hear their own voices more clearly. Samuel once told her one evening, "You've left more than you think." Hannah shook her head. "No. I just don't take away from people what they need to find for themselves." That quote wasn't recorded anywhere. But it spread like how truly important things always spread, slowly, uncontrollably, and persistently. As Hannah began to walk more slowly, Clearbrook Valley became accustomed to waiting for her. No one urged her. No one made the decision for her. Just like Samuel used to do to her before. One late afternoon at the end of the year, Hannah sat by the window watching the children play in the small schoolyard. She thought about Redwood Plain, about her deceased father, and about the long road that had brought her here. She didn't think. If only, she thought, that's enough. Samuel sat beside her, his hand resting on hers. No words were needed. They were accustomed to this wordless presence. If there's one thing Hannah learned after all this, it's this. A life doesn't need to be spectacular to be meaningful. It just needs to be genuine enough for others to rely on it at some point. And in Clearbrook Valley, amidst very ordinary days, Hannah Cole became just that. It wasn't because she was chosen. It was because she chose not to turn her back on herself and on others. Some influences have no physical form. They are not recorded in books, not told as a complete story. They exist in the way a person sits down, the way they listen, the way they don't rush to correct others. In Clearbrook Valley, Hannah Cole's legacy began to spread in that way, quietly, unintentionally, but undeniably. Hannah never claimed to be a role model for anyone. She didn't even think she had overcome anything. She simply lived after she stopped trying to prove that she deserved to live. But it was precisely that cessation of trying that became the most obvious thing to others. One spring morning, Lydia Grant, a young teacher who had recently transferred to the small school in Clearbrook, stood on Hannah's porch for a long time before knocking. Lydia was young, but her eyes already held the weariness of someone who was always afraid of making mistakes, afraid of not being good enough, afraid of not meeting expectations. "I don't know why I'm here," Lydia said after sitting down. "I just heard, you're not in a hurry." Hannah smiled very slightly. "You can sit down now." Lydia spoke about the children in her class. Some were slower, some were falling behind, some were labeled unpromising. Lydia feared that if she didn't push them, they would fall behind. But she also feared that if she pushed them too hard they would break. Hannah listened. Then she said just one thing: some people grow up slowly because they need more time to become themselves. Lydia was silent for a long time. She didn't take notes, she didn't ask any further questions, but those words remained, not as a philosophy but as permission. Years later, people began to notice something different at Clearbrook School, not outstanding academic results, but the way disadvantaged children were no longer left behind in the old way. Lydia didn't say she learned it from Hannah, she just did it in a way that had become ingrained in her. Hannah didn't know that. Just as she didn't know that Eliza Morton, the widow who had knocked on her door in desperation, would later become the first person in the valley to proactively welcome widowed women to live together through the winter. Eliza never said "I did it for Hannah," but when asked, she simply replied, "I once sat next to someone who didn't see me as a problem that needed fixing." Those sayings weren't just quotes, they came to life. Samuel was the one who saw that most clearly. One evening after Hannah had gone to bed early, he sat alone on the porch, watching the lights from the houses scattered across the valley. He thought about how Clearbrook Valley had changed, not richer but gentler. People begin to slow down when talking about others. They are less judgmental. They jump to fewer conclusions. Samuel knew this didn't come from rules or calls. It came from the enduring presence of a person who didn't need to be right. Hannah is still living a perfectly normal life. She grows vegetables, keeps records, mends clothes, walks more slowly. Some days are tiring, some days her joints ache when the weather turns cold. But in her eyes there is no longer any trace of someone who constantly questioned whether she had enough. One afternoon, Lydia brought a girl from her class to meet Hannah. That girl, Rose, was quiet, often looked down, and was usually considered unsociable. "Rose doesn't talk much," Lydia explained, as if she needed to apologize on her behalf. Hannah leaned down to Rose's eye level. "It's okay," she said. "I used to be like that too." Rose looked up. It was a very brief moment, but Lydia realized there are children who simply need to know they are not alone in this world. Hannah didn't hug Rose. She didn't comfort her. She simply let Rose sit beside her, silently watching the sunlight stream through the window. That was all. And that very thing, not being forced to say, not being forced to be different, became a gift. Years later, as Hannah grew weaker, people in the valley began to take turns visiting her, not to care for her, but to be with her. No one said they owed Hannah anything, but the way they sat down, the way they didn't press her to speak, showed they had learned something very deeply. One evening Samuel said to her, "Do you know, people live differently because of you?" Hannah opened her eyes and looked at him. She thought for a moment. "If they live differently," she said slowly, "it's because they were ready, not because of me." Samuel did not object, because that's what Hannah left behind, not influence, but space for others to change themselves. As Hannah closed her eyes to rest on an autumn afternoon, Clearbrook Valley continued its rhythm of life. No announcements, no ceremonies. But at school, Lydia gave a child extra time. At the widow's house, Eliza placed an extra chair. In some corner, someone stopped wondering, "Am I late?" And that's how things that are never said continue to live on. Some stories don't end with a period. They end like an afternoon when the light fades so slowly that one doesn't notice its final moment. That's the story of Hannah Cole. No day is recorded as the last day. No farewells, just days that follow one another, quiet and complete. Clearbrook Valley still wakes up every morning. The wind still blows through the valley along its old path. Birds still perch on the wooden fence. People still light fires, repair houses, plant crops, and argue about trivial matters. Life doesn't stop to acknowledge a person who has lived a decent life, and perhaps that is the right way. Hannah didn't leave many belongings behind. A few old notebooks, a wooden spoon worn down by the years, several pieces of cloth patched up many times. Samuel kept them not as sacred relics, but as objects he had used to live. He didn't put them on a high shelf. He continued to use them, because Hannah had never lived to be displayed. Some mornings Samuel would still think he heard Hannah's footsteps on the porch, but then he would just stand still for a moment, breathe, and continue with the day. not because he had forgotten, but because he had learned how to let the longing not break him. Lydia Grant continues to teach at Clearbrook School. She didn't mention Hannah in her lecture. But when a child falls behind, Lydia doesn't push. She remembered a woman who once said, "Some people grow up slowly because they need more time to become themselves." In the widow's small house, Eliza Morton placed an extra chair at the table, not because there was an extra person, but because there was always room for someone who might need it. None of them called it heritage. They just call it a way of life. If someone were to pass through Clearbrook Valley years from now, they wouldn't find any obvious trace of Hannah Cole. But if they stayed long enough, they would notice something different. People are less quick to judge. They are less likely to say that someone is late. They are less likely to see people as a problem that needs fixing. It's not because they're better. It's because they've learned to look at things from a longer perspective. And if someone like Hannah used to be is sitting alone thinking they've missed every chance to live life to the fullest, chances are they'll meet someone else sitting next to them saying nothing just there. That chain of influence doesn't have a clear starting point. But if you trace it back far, it probably began with a woman who was once told she wasn't worthy of being chosen and decided not to let that be the last thing said about her life. If you are listening to this story, if you've spent years on the fringes, unnamed, unappreciated, let me tell you something. Hannah Cole never said aloud but lived her whole life to prove you're not late. You're not broken. You don't need to be selected to be valuable. There are people who blossom when no one is there to see them, and that doesn't make them any less beautiful. Conversely, that is the most enduring kind of beauty, because it is when people don't need an audience that they truly live. And if this story has stayed with you, even if only as a very vague feeling, then perhaps it has done its part, not to change you, just to sit beside you for a while and remind you your life has never needed to be rushed. As Hannah Cole's story concludes, what remains is not a perfect wedding nor redemption for the past. What remains is a very real truth. There are people who blossom late in life, not because they are flawed, but because the world has taken too long to see them for who they truly are. In life, many of us, especially those who have lived through half their lives, have been labeled not good enough, not pretty enough, not timely enough. And worst of all, we start to believe it. This story doesn't teach you to leave the past in resentment. It teaches you to let go of the past when you've grown older than it. Hannah didn't need her father's apology. She didn't need the town's approval. Because in the end, what matters most isn't who chooses you, but whether you still see your own worth. If you're at an age where society no longer asks, "Who will you become?" but only, "What do you have left?" then this story is for you. Thank you for taking the time to listen, not just with your ears, but with your life experiences. If this story resonates with you, please like and share it with someone who might need to see it. And subscribe to our channel so we can continue telling slow, kind stories for hearts that have weathered many storms. See you again in the next story.